You clicked for the F-35's origin story. This is the Soviet jet that set the template. In 1992, with budgets collapsing, Yakovlev sold 3 non-flyable Yak-141 prototypes and data to Lockheed Martin. That transaction sits at the hinge of aviation history. We'll trace how a canceled 3-engine VTOL fighter, 2 lift engines plus a main engine with a vectored nozzle, fed concepts that reappear in the F-35B's single-engine, shaft-driven lift fan architecture. Same vertical lift problem, different solution. And the irony is that a fleet defense fighter Moscow abandoned became part of the foundation for today's stealth VTOL. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. So, picking up from that handoff, the question writes itself. How did a risky 3-engine hover layout become the stepping stone for a supersonic carrier fighter that the Navy then walked away from? The lineage starts with Soviet hover rigs. Yakovlev watched British experiments and built the YAKV test stands, then the Yak-36 and -36M. Without a single high-bypass vectored thrust core, they went with what their industry could support: discrete lift devices and a separate propulsion stream. The Yak-36 used steerable nozzles and piped compressed air for balance in hover, which kept the research moving but set a pattern. Lift was something you bolted on, and cruise thrust was a different problem. That became doctrine on the Yak-38, which entered service in the mid-1970s. 2 vertical lift engines sat behind the cockpit, while a main engine handled forward flight. It gave ships on the Black Sea and Pacific fleets a jet that could operate from short decks. But the split architecture carried hidden costs. Every kilogram of deadweight lift engine you carry in cruise is fuel or weapons you cannot take, and those lift engines produce little value once your wings level at altitude. The bigger hazard surfaced in hover. In a tri-engine VTOL, a single lift engine failure doesn't have vertical thrust. It creates an instant asymmetric moment, and the aircraft can depart before a pilot can react. The Yak-38 addressed this with an automatic ejection system that would fire the seat when sensors saw an unrecoverable attitude change. It worked as a last resort lifesaver, but it also triggered in benign regimes often enough to write off airframes. The trade was stark. You saved pilots from unrecoverable dynamics, but you also proved that the configuration itself built in failure modes that were difficult to tame. Heat and decks were the second constraint. Lift jets ingest and recirculate hot gas at low speeds, and the main nozzle's exhaust impinges near the ship. High ambient temperatures further reduce thrust margin, so hot and high performance suffered and payloads shrank. Tests in warm climates exposed tight hover time limits and practical weapon restrictions, which in turn constrained real missions from Kiev-class carriers where the Yak-38 operated. So, by this point, the Soviet Navy wanted a supersonic fighter with radar and real weapons, not just a point defense strike jet. Yakovlev's answer, initiated in the mid-1970s, kept the split. 2 lift engines plus a main engine. But the aim shifted to Mach capability and a credible interceptor fit. The centerpiece was a rotating vectored main nozzle that had to carry afterburner flow without melting itself or the ship, and a coordinated automatic control system that sequenced doors, nozzles, and throttle, so pilots weren't juggling 3 engines and reaction controls during transition. Hover stability fixes became design features. Engineers managed cooling flow around the aft nozzle to bring exhaust temperatures down where it met the deck, which helped infrared signature and surface life. They shaped the aft fuselage and doors to steer the plume away from the airframe and reduce re-ingestion, so the engines saw cooler, denser air. Think of it like ducting a workshop fan. The air still moves, but directing it makes the whole system behave. Reported thrust and thermal limits from the earlier aircraft set the envelope they had to beat. The Yak-38's margins in heat and payload were tight, and operators felt that on Kiev-class ships in warm weather. The Yak-141 promised more thrust and a better balance, but adding radar, weapons integration, and a robust afterburning nozzle drove the schedule and raised cost. In any case, the timing was brutal. Funding collapsed in 1991. Operational risk in hover remained, shipborne opportunities were narrow, and naval priorities shifted. Trials showed promise, but procurement had no oxygen. With prototypes grounded and a program without a patron, What happens to cutting-edge VTOL know-how when the factory lights dim? So, with that anticlimax, the obvious question becomes practical. If the Yak used 2 lift engines and 1 main engine, why does the F-35B rely on a single core driving a lift fan? And what, if anything, actually transferred across that gap? The 1992 handoff was not a shopping trip for a flyable fighter. It was a data exchange. Lockheed obtained 3 non-flyable airframes, wind tunnel results, control law documentation, and nozzle geometry work. That is a knowledge bridge. It told engineers which corners of the VTOL envelope produced control lag, which sequences helped pilots, and which geometries kept hot exhaust off the deck and out of the intakes. It did not hand across a blueprint for a Western jet. Western VTOL was not new. Harrier solved subsonic jump jet requirements with a single Pegasus and 4 rotating nozzles. But a supersonic, stealth-compatible VTOL forced different integration. Thermal loads rise steeply with afterburning flow. Transition demands faster, more precise control scheduling. Deck compatibility adds temperature limits, plume impingement angles, and material constraints. So the problem set grew even before you added low observable shaping or internal bays. Yak 141 treated those problems as a coordinated system. The swiveling main nozzle vectored thrust aft for flight and down for lift, and the airplane automated start, door sequencing, nozzle rotation, and reaction jets, so a pilot didn't hand fly 3 machines at once. That logic, sequence the airplane, not just the engine, maps directly to control architecture, even when the hardware looks different. And the hardware did look different. Yak 141 carried 2 dedicated lift engines behind the cockpit and 1 afterburning main engine for flight, with doors that closed in cruise. The F-35B uses a single engine that splits power. A shaft drives a vertical lift fan ahead of the center of gravity. A clutch engages for STOVL modes. The rear nozzle swivels to balance the moment, and roll is trimmed with wing roll post nozzles. One layout parks dead weight in cruise. The other accepts a transmission and clutch for hover, then carries the fan as inert mass at speed. Different compromises, same goal. Public statements acknowledge Yak inputs on nozzle geometry and lift system aerothermal understanding. That's the piece that crosses architectures cleanly. How hot gas rolls under a fuselage. How a door edge feeds or starves a fan. How to align a nozzle to reduce recirculation. By contrast, stealth shaping, internal weapon bays, and sensor fusion belong to Western programs. They sit on the other side of the firewall from VTOL mechanics. Think of it like solving the same math problem with a different method. Both aircraft need stable hover and manageable temperatures. Yak puts extra engines where the lift is needed and accepts asymmetric failure risk. F-35B sends cold, dense air through a fan to generate lift with better thermal margins, using a power split from the main core. The answers match to 2 decimal places, but the steps on the page don't. Lockheed's X-35B demonstrations then validated that method. Short takeoff, transition, hover, and supersonic dash showed the single-engine lift fan path worked in practice. Data from Yakovlev helped avoid dead ends. It flagged transition rate limits, plume behavior near the tail, and control law pitfalls during nozzle rotation. You didn't need to copy hardware to avoid the trapdoors. So the payoff is specific. Vectored thrust, nozzle know-how transferred as geometry and materials lessons. Transition control principles transferred as sequencing and authority management. Aerothermal deck and infrared lessons transferred as limits and margins. It was therefore a Soviet fleet defender feeding a Western stealth VTOL, and the chain of consequence runs straight through that one difficult year. The Yak 141 didn't disappear. Its wind tunnel curves, nozzle maps, and transition logic shortened the path to a different answer. A canceled Soviet VTOL became background math for a 5th-generation jet, and it was therefore a rare case where sunk cost bought future certainty without a single copied part. If you want a deeper dive into the X-35B test phase and how deck thermal limits shaped flight envelopes, say so in the comments, and we'll expand the series. One way or another, abandoned projects reappear as constraints and lessons. Not replicas, but guardrails and margins embedded in the next machine, where the numbers carry the memory.